Another interesting story that's unfolding in India, and that is by the way of G20, India's G20 presidency. There are efforts being taken, Amit, to ensure that crypto regulation becomes a reality.
Yeah, so India has submitted a presidency note to the G20 to basically chalk down a roadmap for crypto assets and the risks related to crypto assets and regulating them. Now, their implication basically was towards emerging markets and developing economies. There is a certain report that states that early enthusiasm towards cryptocurrency is fading in these nations. So this first report has been filed, and a synthesis report will be prepared after this first note has been filed, and a synthesis report will be prepared by the IMF and the Financial Stability Board, and which will be discussed in the next summit. So that is where India stands right now on crypto. There is a concern. The enthusiasm is fading. Crypto assets regulation is a concern. So this is where the roadmap is basically, the world is basically looking at a roadmap to basically address these issues.
And they're looking at a global framework, and it's interesting since we're talking about G20.
It needs a global framework.
Absolutely, needs a global framework, and we're talking about India's G20 presidency. I think it also brings me to an important picture that Prime Minister Modi also shared on social media with all the central bank governors, Geeta Gopinath, and finance ministers, calling it women empowerment. All those ministers, of course, and the central bank governors meeting in Gandhinagar in Gujarat. Crypto regulation continues to be a key concern. There needs to be regulation, but there is no consensus just as yet. This paper presented by India could give us some insight or way forward into what a regulation could look like as far as cryptocurrency is concerned. I think one of the major concerns for India is using crypto for financing terrorism, and they've taken that up in their agenda over and over now.
So, Shweta, there are the report that or the paper that India has submitted as part of its G20 presidency is basically highlighting three principles on which a crypto regulation should be formed, which will safeguard India's interest at least, right? Now, these three are, number one, being economic and financial stability. So you don't want a deregulated asset class or currency class disrupting the financial stability of, let's say, the central bank, which is the RBI, economic stability of the country as a whole, and in addition to that, even let's say, the security markets, right? The whole SEBI highlight on security markets and shares, which are also another asset class. We don't want any disruption on economic and financial stability. So that is point number one as far as India goes. Number two, I think India is very clear in its paper that investor education and the risks associated with not protecting the investor. So investor protection and investor education are going to be very, very key central tenets of whatever regulation India wants to push on the crypto side. The third, equally important one, which I think is more lip service than something that we truly believe in when it comes to crypto, is this whole notion of not stifling technological innovation, right? So these are three concerns that India has tabled as part of its presidency paper. And it says that we want financial stability, economic stability to not be disrupted. We want investors to be protected and educated, yet we don't want to stifle technological innovation, right? So let's develop a framework at a global level which addresses these three challenges and becomes a very potent regulatory framework which prevents, let's say, issues like terror financing, which prevents issues like destability, money laundering and destability of global markets, right? Now, RBI has, ever since we started hearing of crypto, RBI has been very skeptical of cryptocurrencies. In fact, on the sidelines of the G20 FM and central bank governors meet, Shaktikanta Das has again come on record and stated that he is going to continue backing the ban on crypto assets. At the same time, you've got the Bank for International Settlements, bank as in BANQUE, BIS, which again says that crypto is a fairly unsuitable tool to become a replacement for currency as we know it, right? So I think the whole debate again is you keep an unregulated animal out there which has great technology riding on it, but you don't know who's going to tame that animal. Is it going to be the central bank? If that is the case, you consider crypto to be a currency. Is it going to be financial markets regulator, SEBI? Then you say, hey, crypto is an asset class. Is it going to be, let's say, the Ministry of IT? Then you're saying it's just a technology with no real monetary value attached to it. So I think this whole thing is going to now, with India tabling its concerns in the capacity of G20 president, ahead of the September meeting, we should see some concrete framework being proposed at least, and thereafter being implemented.
I think a question that will remain is whether this, and as you pointed out, whether this is going to be a framework for India and who presides over this framework. Would this be a global framework or only for G20 countries, since we're only talking about G20 finance ministers meet?
I think, I think bodies like G20, bodies like ASEAN, bodies like SAARC, while they generate a lot of influence on how the world should function or how a region or a bloc should function. I think at the end of the day, every country is absolutely unique in what it needs as part of of its own regulatory framework. Every country will be very closely monitoring its own regulations, its own legal and social obligations to its citizens, and every country will hold the right to execute a framework which is central to what their country believes is the right path for them. India is trying right now through its G20 presidency to push for a framework which will influence the regulation across this G20 bloc and in turn the rest of the world. But I think it'll not really be able to implement something outside of the borders of India despite the G20 presidency.
Right. But as far as cryptocurrencies, there's some sort of regulation that we could see coming into place or being kicked in by September of this year, at least a framework upon which perhaps G20 nations will draw their own crypto regulation going forward.
It could be beyond G20, because what they've said is this report, the synthesis report, is going to be prepared by the IMF and the Financial Stability Board. So that is a little bigger. So I believe India is using its clout in the G20 to basically push for this. So that's where it stands.
All right. So that's news that people who are trading in cryptocurrency will have to keep an eye on.